Welcome to My Sanctuary in Soil and our first Garden Basics series. And today, or in this video, we're going to look at the step number 3 of your first Garden Basics. And that step number 3 is when to plant your garden. This matters a lot depending on where you live. And so before I start, I want to give you a heads up as I realize as I'm going in this video series that there's a lot of information here, and probably each and every one of those steps that I'm sharing with you requires a lot more in-depth knowledge, right? I've been learning through this. This is my third gardening season, and there's a lot to learn, but I only want to give you the basics, enough for you to start your first garden. But as I do more tutorials specifically on all the things that I talk in these videos, I will be adding links in the description or in the notes of this video so that you can go, if for example you want to learn more about what we're talking about in this video, just go to the notes section and you're going to see links to more in-depth videos and tutorials. Okay, let's get started with the third step of your first garden basic, which is when to plant your garden. To talk about that, we need to discuss, first of all, your planting zone. Your planting zone basically says, within your region, what is the lowest temperature that your region reaches. This is very important because your plants, some of them may die once it reaches those cold temperatures. Based on the USDA, they have determined or made a map, I'm going to show it right here, that shows you within the regions what is the lowest temperature in those regions. So I'm also going to link put a link below where you can go and then put in your information for your area so that you can find out what is the lowest temperature that your area reaches. For example, for me, I am in zone 7B, borderline zone 8. I am in the middle of Georgia. And that means that the lowest temperature that we can reach here is between 10 and minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that's in Celsius. I'll put it in here once I figure it out. So this is important because this will determine whether the plants that some people call perennials are really perennial in your zone, or maybe they're not, right? And what that means is that there are some plants that if it doesn't get below a certain temperature, they will not die at the end of the season, but they will continue to go on and on and on. And that will decide when you are going to plant your garden, right? That is also referred as plant hardiness, meaning how hardy is that particular plant to cold temperatures. Right now, I'm in the middle of my winter. As you can see, I'm here with my sweater and my vest in my garden. Not a lot to see, but what you see in my garden is things that are called brassicas, or they're called hardy. So back there you're going to see some broccoli, I have cauliflower, I have Brussels sprouts, I have cabbage. So all those are called brassicas, and brassicas for the most part are called hardy, meaning that they can handle temperatures below 32 degrees or 0 Celsius. We have actually reached that temperature, and and some of my my garden was under a couple inches of snow not too long ago, and yet it is doing quite well. Some of the plants got damaged, maybe some of my kale, but because it did not stay in that low temperature for too long, they bounce right back. Now, if it had been a lot lower temperature for a lot longer, some of them would not have made it, right? And so you need to know what is that low temperature that your region hits so that you can then determine what plants can do well and what plants can't. Now, if you are in the colder zones, right, up north, and you do get lower temperatures for a sustainable amount of time, that just means that you need to have a greenhouse or some sort of protection for your plants so that they can withstand that low temperature. Now, some plants you can only do so much before they die anyways, right? And so that is the things that you need to know to find out what is that low temperature that your area hits, okay? The second thing that you need to know is the season in which what is the length of your season in your area. And that is the date or the season is marked by the last frost date, meaning the last time that your area gets below 32 degrees, and the first day that your area gets below 32 degrees. You need to know that, and that is your garden season, right? For example, here in Georgia, my last frost date is April 1st. So more than likely after April 1st, we're not going to get below 32 degrees. That means that I can plant things that will die at 32 because we're probably not going to get to 32. So that's when my planting season starts. Now, my planting season goes all the way to October 31st, which is the date in which the likelihood of having my first frost date, meaning the first day that I go below 32 degrees and a lot of my plants die, happens between, after that time. And so my growing season is then when you go from April 1st to October 31st is 210 days. That is for me in the middle of Georgia. Now, for you to find out what your first and last, or your last and first frost date is, you need to go, and I'm going to give you a link below where you can then put in there your date, and you can put first frost date and then last frost date, and you'll have your dates. Now with that information, you can count how many days between those two there are, and based on those days, that is your growing season. Now, even though it does get below 32 degrees, some areas don't get too far below 32. Like for example, for us, I mentioned that our lowest temperature is between 10 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and I think we were at 19 degrees a couple of weeks ago, which is especially the times that we had snow. But it doesn't really get much below that. So that means that it is really not that hard of a frost. There are three categories of how cold it gets. So first, a light freeze is between 29 and 32 degrees. That means that between 29 and 32 degrees, only your tender plants would be killed, right? That's minus 1.7 to 0 Celsius. So in that, only your tender plants are killed. Tomatoes, for example, peppers, they don't really like cold at all. Then you have moderate freeze. That's 25 degrees to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, or minus 3.9 to minus 2.2 Celsius. That is widely destructive, to most vegetation. And then they have the severe freeze. That's 24 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, which is minus 4.4 Celsius. That can do very heavy damage of most garden plants. Now, this is assuming that your plants are at that temperature for a prolonged period of time. Now, my plants, when it did get to the 19 degrees, they were there for only, a couple of hours. So they were able to get a little bit of damage, but they were able to bounce right back because we got to then 30, 40 degrees quite quickly. Up in the northern areas, you might end up being at those temperatures for a prolonged period of time. And at that point, unless you have some special cover or greenhouse, your plants are not going to survive. So that is why it's so important for you to know, number one, your planting zone, to know how low your temperatures get in your area, and number two, the length of your season, because remember, some plants are considered perennials if they are in the temperature in which allows them to be perennials, and some of them are annuals, meaning that they grow and they die. Now, in your seed envelopes, see, for example, this one. This is my purple basil, one of my favorite plants. I love this basil. It's purple. I love the color. So, for example, your purple basil, your envelope in the back will have information that is very valuable for you, which is the next thing that you need to know, which is your seed to harvest cycle, right? Remember that in my planting season is 210 days. That means I had 210 days for me to plant, germinate, grow, and then harvest whatever I plant. So, for example, this purple basil, it takes 6 to 10 days to germinate, meaning the moment I put the seed in the soil, it takes 6 to 10 days to germinate, but then it says here 60 days before I can start to harvest this basil, right? Because if I start harvesting whatever leaves are coming out at that point, I will then stunt its growth. And so that's why it's important for you to know that once you pick the plants that you want to grow, which we're going to get to it, so don't start buying things yet. Once you decide what you want to buy, then you're going to need to research, right, how long it takes to germinate and how long it takes for this plant to grow, mature, and be able to harvest what you want from those plants, right? Very, very important. Something else that will help you once you know your growing season is if you are able to do succession planting, meaning that if this is a 60 days, that means that, you know, I have 210 days to plant. So 60 days, that means that in 60 days I can start, you know, harvesting basil. Now my basil, this particular basil, will last the whole season. But for example, if I want to plant radishes are about 50 days to harvest. That means that I plant them 50 days, I can harvest them, I can plant again, and 50 days I harvest, and that's 100 days, and I can plant again, 50 days I harvest them, and then I can plant them again, 50 days I harvest it. So 4 times 50 days, assuming I'm planting in the same place, I can actually plant and harvest radishes 4 times in my garden season. But if your garden season is only 100 days, that means you can only plant and harvest radishes 2 times. You see how that's affected? Now, if your garden season is 150 days and you want to plant something that takes 150 days to be ready and start producing, then you may not want to do that, because then those plants are not going to be ready before it gets too cold for them to produce. Something else that you can do when deciding when to plant is, if your growing season is too short, you can actually get ahead by planting your seeds indoors in growing lights. But now that is the next level, you know, and I would not recommend you to do that in your first garden basics. I didn't do it. I actually started with starter plants, but we're going to talk about that in a future video. So in more advanced videos, we'll talk about succession planning, and we'll talk about how to start, you know, indoor and all those things. But I do not suggest at all that you do that in your first garden. Okay, I just wanted to mention it so that you understand how that works. But I hope that this was a value, that you're starting to understand the things that you need to consider in your first garden. And so that concludes the 3rd step of when to plant. And so in the next video, we're going to talk about the 4th step, and that is of where to plant. And that's when we're going to get into beds and pots and in-ground and all those things. All right, but let me not get ahead. We'll see you in the next video on where to plant your first garden. See you then.